Story 1. The Hollow Trees. Chapter 1. The Forest That Breathed. Maggie and her older brother, Ethan, had grown up near Ashwood Forest, a place infamous for its unsettling quiet. On a dare from their friends, the siblings ventured deep into the woods to find the so-called breathing trees. Legends claimed that on cold nights, these ancient oaks would exhale a mist that whispered your darkest fears. At first, the forest seemed ordinary, twisting roots, dense underbrush, and the distant sound of crows. But as twilight descended, the air shifted. The once pleasant scent of pine turned metallic, and the wind seemed to carry faint whispers. Ethan brushed it off, but Maggie couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. The whispers grew louder as they reached a clearing filled with ancient, gnarled trees. Their trunks seemed to pulsate, as though alive. "It's just the wind," Ethan muttered, but Maggie's gut told her otherwise. She reached out to touch the bark of one tree, only to feel it shiver beneath her fingers. A low, guttural sigh echoed through the clearing, and the siblings realized the trees weren't whispering, they were breathing. Chapter 2. Faces in the Bark. Night fell quickly in the forest, swallowing the clearing in inky darkness. Ethan flicked on his flashlight, but the beam only seemed to make the shadows dance more menacingly. Maggie pointed out strange shapes in the bark, faces contorted in pain, their mouths open as if mid-scream. "It's just knots in the wood," Ethan said, though his voice wavered. The air grew colder, and the whispers became clearer, forming words. "Turn back," one hissed. Another murmured, "They took us, now they'll take you." Maggie gripped Ethan's arm, her nails digging into his skin. They both froze as one of the faces in the bark slowly turned toward them, its eyes opening to reveal empty, black voids. A scream echoed through the clearing, but it wasn't from either of them, it was from the trees. Chapter 3. Roots That Move. Maggie stumbled back, pulling Ethan with her. The face in the tree twisted further, the wooden features cracking like old porcelain as it let out a bone-chilling groan. "This isn't real," Ethan muttered, his voice shaking. But his disbelief faltered when the ground beneath them began to shift. Roots as thick as arms writhed out of the soil, moving like snakes, forming a barrier around the clearing. Maggie clutched her flashlight, scanning the area. The faces in the trees multiplied. Dozens of them emerged from the bark, their hollow eyes fixed on the siblings. Each whispered in a different tone, some pleading, others laughing, but all inescapable. "Ethan, we have to leave," Maggie cried. She tugged on his arm, but he was frozen, staring at a root that had coiled around his ankle. Slowly, the root tightened, dragging him toward the largest tree in the clearing. Chapter 4. The Feeding Ground. Panic surged through Maggie as she grabbed a fallen branch, hacking at the root around Ethan's leg. It was like cutting into leather, and every strike caused the whispers to turn into shrieks of pain. The face in the tree closest to them moved again, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. Maggie swore she saw sharp, wooden teeth forming inside the hollow maw. Finally, the root snapped, and Ethan staggered to his feet. But the clearing wasn't done with them. More roots burst from the ground, snatching at their feet as they ran. The whispers rose to a deafening cacophony, each word stabbing into Maggie's mind like a dagger. "You shouldn't have come. You can't leave. Feed us," Ethan tripped, falling face-first into the dirt, and Maggie screamed as she saw roots beginning to twist around his arms and neck. Chapter 5. The Tree's Hunger. Ethan thrashed wildly, his breath coming in panicked gasps as the roots dragged him toward the largest tree. This one was different. Its bark glistened with a dark, sticky sap that smelled of rot. The faces in its trunk weren't twisted like the others. They were calm, serene, as though they'd accepted their fate. Maggie lunged forward, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling with every ounce of strength she had. The tree groaned, its bark splitting open to reveal a hollow cavity within. Inside, the siblings glimpsed something that made their blood run cold, a mass of bones and scraps of clothing. This wasn't just a tree, it was a predator, feeding on anyone who wandered too close. Maggie screamed as the roots tightened their grip on Ethan, pulling him inch by inch toward the opening. Chapter 6. The Bargain. Desperation took over Maggie. She grabbed her flashlight and aimed it directly at the tree's hollow mouth. "Let him go," she shouted, her voice breaking. The tree hesitated, its roots pausing mid-motion. The whispers softened, as if the forest were listening. A voice clearer than the rest echoed from the largest tree, deep and resonant. One must stay. Maggie's heart dropped. The meaning was clear. Either she or Ethan had to remain behind. No, she whispered, shaking her head. The roots around Ethan slackened slightly, as though waiting for her decision. Maggie felt her chest tighten as she looked at her brother, who was gasping for air. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Take me instead." The roots snapped toward her in an instant, coiling around her legs and arms, pulling her toward the tree's hollow. Chapter 7. Inside the hollow. The darkness inside the tree was suffocating, and the air reeked of decay. Maggie screamed as the roots pulled her deeper, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering uselessly to the ground outside. Ethan's voice called out to her, but it was distant, drowned out by the whispers that now filled her ears. Inside, she felt the presence of something ancient, something alive. The walls of the hollow pulsed like a beating heart, and Maggie realized with horror that the tree was absorbing her. Its roots tightened around her chest, and she felt her strength fading. Faces began to appear in the bark around her, their mouths moving silently, their eyes filled with despair. She realized they were the others who had made the same choice, the forest's victims, trapped for eternity. Chapter 8. A desperate escape. Ethan wasn't willing to let his sister go. He grabbed the flashlight Maggie had dropped and began hacking at the roots with all his strength. The tree roared in pain, its bark splitting open further, but it refused to release its grip on Maggie. "Hold on," Ethan shouted, his voice trembling. Maggie felt herself slipping away. Her vision blurred, and the whispers grew louder, promising her peace if she just let go. But Ethan's voice cut through the noise, grounding her. With one final swing, Ethan managed to sever the thickest root, and Maggie tumbled out of the hollow, gasping for air. The whispers turned to furious screams, and the forest seemed to shudder as the siblings stumbled away. Chapter 9. The Forest's Wrath. The forest didn't let them go so easily. As they ran, the trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at the siblings like skeletal hands. The ground beneath them rippled as more roots emerged, trying to trip them. Maggie's legs felt like lead, her body still weak from the tree's grip, but she refused to stop. Ethan spotted a faint light in the distance, the edge of the forest. "We're almost there," he shouted, grabbing Maggie's hand. The trees groaned, their faces twisting in rage as they reached for the fleeing siblings. Just as the roots were about to ensnare them again, the two burst through the tree line and collapsed onto the grass beyond. Chapter 10. The Warning. The siblings didn't look back as they staggered home, their clothes torn and their bodies covered in scratches. When they finally reached their front porch, they collapsed, too exhausted to speak. Maggie looked down at her arms and noticed faint marks on her skin, patterns that resembled the tree's roots, as if it had left its mark on her. That night, neither of them slept. Every time Maggie closed her eyes, she heard the whispers. They were softer now, but still there, lingering at the edge of her mind. She realized with a sinking feeling that the forest wasn't done with them. And as she glanced out the window, she thought she saw the silhouette of a tree, its branches reaching toward the house. Story 2. The Lake of Lost Echoes. Chapter 1. The Ripples. Sam and Clara had always loved their family's lakeside cabin, a peaceful retreat nestled deep in the wilderness. That summer, however, the lake seemed different, eerily still during the day but alive at night with strange ripples that broke its glassy surface. Sam dismissed it as fish or wind, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from beneath the water. One evening, as the siblings skipped stones along the shore, Clara heard something unusual. A faint echo bounced back, repeating her voice but with an odd distortion. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Sam nodded, his brow furrowed. They both tried again, yelling out random words, and each time, the lake mimicked them. But as the echoes returned, they weren't quite right. Clara shivered as she heard her own voice repeat, "Come closer." Chapter 2. Voices Beneath the Surface. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while the gentle lapping of the water played in the background. Suddenly, she heard a faint humming sound, like a low chorus rising from the lake. Curious and unable to resist, she crept to the window. The moon illuminated the water, and Clara froze when she saw the ripples forming perfect concentric circles. Leaning closer, she swore she saw something moving beneath the surface, a shadow, long and sinuous, gliding just out of reach of the moonlight. Her heart pounded as the humming grew louder. Then, she heard it, a voice calling her name. Not an echo, not distorted, just her name, clear and melodic. It was coming from the lake. Chapter 3: The Stranger in the Water. The next morning, Clara told Sam about the voice, but he waved her off. "You're just spooked," he said. "It's probably a loon or something." Determined to prove him wrong, Clara dragged him to the shoreline. The lake was deceptively calm, its surface shimmering under the sunlight. But as they stood there, a ripple spread across the water, followed by another faint echo. This time, it was Sam's voice calling, "Who's there?" Both siblings froze as the water began to churn. Slowly, a figure emerged, a woman with long, dark hair and eyes that glowed faintly silver. Her body seemed to meld with the water, ripples cascading off her like a living tide. "Leave this place," she whispered, her voice layered with the distorted echoes they had heard before. "Or you'll join the others." The figure dissolved back into the water, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt unnatural. Chapter 4: The Drowning Song. Later that day, Clara and Sam tried to make sense of what they had seen. "A ghost," Clara whispered. "Or something worse," Sam replied. As evening fell, the lake grew restless again. This time, the humming transformed into a song, a haunting melody that seemed to rise from the depths. It was beautiful yet sinister, and Clara found herself drawn to it despite her fear. Sam grabbed her arm, pulling her back from the shoreline. "It's trying to lure you," he said, his voice sharp. Clara snapped out of her trance, realizing how close she'd been to stepping into the water. The ripples intensified, and the distorted echoes began to sound more like screams. "We need to leave," Sam said, his face pale. But the lake wasn't going to let them go that easily. Chapter 5: The First Victim. That night, the lake claimed its first victim. The siblings were startled awake by a piercing scream. Rushing outside, they saw their neighbor, Mr. Reynolds, standing waist-deep in the water. His face was twisted in terror as he clawed at something unseen pulling him further in. "Help me," he cried, but the water surged up to his chest, cutting off his words. Sam and Clara froze, helpless as they watched the lake swallow him whole. His screams echoed long after he disappeared, fading into the same haunting melody they had heard before. The ripples stilled, and the lake returned to its deceptive calm. Clara gripped Sam's hand, her mind racing. "It's hunting us," she whispered. "We're next." Chapter 6: The Echoing Shore. The next day, they packed to leave, but every attempt to get to the car was thwarted. The keys were missing, and the old dirt road to town was blocked by a fallen tree. Frustrated and frightened, Sam decided to call for help, but his phone had no signal. "It's like the lake doesn't want us to leave," Clara said, her voice trembling. As the sun set, they noticed footprints along the shore, bare, wet footprints that led into the forest but never came back out. Sam grabbed a flashlight and followed the trail, determined to find answers. But the deeper they went, the darker the forest became, until it was impossible to tell where the lake ended and the trees began. Chapter 7: The Reflection. When they returned to the lake, they found something chilling. A reflection rippled across the surface, but it wasn't their own. It was a woman's face, her hollow eyes staring back at them, her mouth moving soundlessly. Then, to their horror, the reflection began to mimic Clara's movements, as though it were her doppelganger trapped beneath the water. "What does it want?" Clara whispered, her voice shaking. The reflection twisted into a grotesque smile, and Sam stepped between her and the water. "It wants to take you," he said grimly. "Like it took Mr. Reynolds." The siblings retreated to the cabin, but the song followed them, growing louder and more insistent. Chapter 8: The Whispering Depths. Desperate, Sam scoured their grandfather's journals, hoping to find something about the lake's dark past. What he found was worse than they imagined. Decades ago, a woman had drowned in the lake, lured by the same haunting melody. Locals believed the lake was cursed, feeding on anyone who dared to stay too long. As Sam read, Clara heard the humming again, this time inside the cabin. She turned to see water dripping from the walls, pooling at her feet. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, and the distorted echoes returned, whispering her name. She grabbed Sam's arm. "We can't stay here." Chapter 9. Into the water. With no other choice, the siblings decided to confront the lake. Armed with flashlights and a desperate plan, they approached the water's edge. The ripples began immediately, the haunting song rising to a deafening crescendo. "Show yourself," Sam yelled. The woman appeared again, her body shimmering like liquid, her face unreadable. "Leave, or you'll stay forever," she warned. But Clara stepped forward, trembling. "What do you want from us?" The woman's silver eyes bore into hers, and the whispers grew louder. Clara gasped as visions flooded her mind, faces trapped beneath the water, screaming silently, their hands reaching toward the surface. Chapter 10. The Final Choice. The woman extended a hand, beckoning Clara toward the water. "One must stay," she said, her voice cold and final. Clara looked at Sam, her heart sinking. "No," Sam said firmly, stepping between her and the figure. "You're not taking her." He grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the woman, but it passed through her like mist. The lake surged, pulling both siblings toward its depths. Clara screamed as the water rose around her, icy cold and relentless. But as the ripples consumed them, she grabbed Sam's hand and whispered, "Hold on." The siblings fought with everything they had, clawing their way back to shore. When they finally escaped, gasping for air, the lake fell silent. The ripples stilled, and the song disappeared. But as they drove away, Clara glanced back and saw her reflection in the rearview mirror. For a split second, her eyes glowed silver. Story 3. The Whispering Grove. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Path. Deep in the heart of Willowbrook lay a grove no one dared to enter. The villagers called it the Whispering Grove, claiming it was haunted by the voices of those who had disappeared there. Maya and her best friend, Oliver, had always been curious about the place. They had heard the warnings, but curiosity got the better of them one misty autumn morning. The path leading to the grove was overgrown, and the air was unnaturally still. As they stepped through the thickets, Maya felt an odd pressure in her ears, like the forest was holding its breath. The trees ahead were taller than those they'd passed, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. When the first whisper came, faint but clear, it sent a chill down Maya's spine. "Help us." Chapter 2. The Murmuring Trees. Oliver laughed nervously. "Wind through the trees," he said, but Maya wasn't so sure. The whispers seemed too deliberate, too human. They grew louder the deeper they went, forming disjointed sentences. "Don't leave. They'll find you." Maya's heart raced as she looked around. "They're coming from the trees," she said. Oliver shone his flashlight on one of the trunks, and his breath hitched. The bark seemed to shift under the light, forming fleeting shapes, hands, faces, mouths open mid-scream. Before Oliver could respond, a low growl rumbled through the grove. It wasn't human, nor was it any animal they recognized. "We need to go back," Maya whispered. But when they turned, the path they had come down was gone. Chapter 3. Eyes in the Dark. Panic set in as they realized the grove had closed around them. The trees loomed impossibly tall, their gnarled branches blotting out the sky. Oliver took Maya's hand, and they began to move quickly, hoping to find another way out. But the whispers grew louder, surrounding them, echoing their own voices back at them. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Maya saw movement. At first, she thought it was just shadows shifting, but then she saw them, pairs of glowing, yellow eyes blinking in the darkness between the trees. They weren't animals. The eyes were too high, too still. "We're not alone," she said, her voice barely audible. Oliver followed her gaze and froze. The eyes blinked once, then vanished. Chapter 4. The Watchers. The air grew heavy as the whispers turned into a low, guttural chant. "Do you hear that?" Oliver asked, his voice shaking. Maya nodded, her pulse quickening. The chant was rhythmic, like a sinister lullaby, and it seemed to be coming from all around them. Suddenly, they saw them, figures cloaked in shadows, standing motionless among the trees. The Watchers, as the villagers called them, had been a ghost story, a bedtime tale to scare children into staying away from the grove. But now they were real, their forms barely visible in the dim light. One stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face was obscured, but Maya could feel its gaze piercing through her. "Run," Oliver whispered, but neither of them could move. Chapter 5: The Mark of the Grove. When they finally broke free from their paralysis, Maya and Oliver sprinted through the grove, dodging branches and roots that seemed to reach out for them. The Watchers didn't chase them, but their presence lingered, the chant following the pair no matter how far they ran. Maya tripped and fell, her hand landing on a root that was warm to the touch. When Oliver helped her up, they both noticed a mark on her palm, a strange, spiral-shaped scar that hadn't been there before. "It's from the root," Maya said, her voice trembling. "It burned me." The scar pulsed faintly, sending waves of heat up her arm. "We have to get out of here," Oliver said, his eyes wide with fear. Chapter 6: The Tree at the Center. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into a clearing at the heart of the grove. At its center stood a massive tree, its trunk wider than a car and its branches stretching endlessly into the mist. The whispers were deafening here, a chorus of voices crying out in anguish. "This must be the source," Oliver said, staring at the tree in awe. Maya approached cautiously, her marked hand throbbing with pain. As she got closer, she saw faces etched into the bark, hundreds of them, their mouths moving silently. "These are the missing villagers," she said, horrified. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to shake, and the tree's roots rose, forming a circle around the clearing. They were trapped. Chapter 7: The Offering. The whispers shifted, forming words that Maya and Oliver could understand. "One must stay." The roots tightened around them, herding them closer to the tree. Maya clutched her scarred hand, the heat unbearable now. She realized the tree was communicating with her, feeding her its intentions. "It needs someone," she said, tears streaming down her face. "No," Oliver said firmly, stepping between her and the tree. "We're both getting out of here." But the tree had other plans. A root shot out, coiling around Oliver's ankle and dragging him toward the trunk. He screamed, clawing at the dirt, but it was no use. Maya hesitated, torn between saving him and escaping while she still could. Chapter 8: The Bargain. "Wait!" Maya shouted, holding up her marked hand. The tree stopped, its roots retreating slightly. "You already took something from me," she said, her voice shaking. "Isn't that enough?" The tree seemed to consider her words, its whispers turning softer, almost contemplative. Then, a single root slithered forward, coiling around her wrist. She felt a sharp pain as the spiral mark burned brighter, spreading up her arm like a living tattoo. The whispers faded, replaced by a single, chilling command: "Leave, and never return." The roots released Oliver, dropping him to the ground. Chapter 9: The Escape. Maya helped Oliver to his feet, and together they ran, the path before them suddenly clear. The trees seemed to part, guiding them out of the grove. But the forest wasn't letting them go without a final warning. As they ran, the faces in the trees turned to watch them, their hollow eyes following their every move. When they finally burst into the open air, the whispers stopped, and the grove behind them seemed to disappear into the mist. Maya's hand still burned, the spiral mark now etched deep into her skin. She knew it wasn't over, that the grove had claimed a part of her, and it would call her back one day. Chapter 10: The Whispers Return. Back in the village, they tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed them. The grove was just a story, they were told, a tale to keep children from wandering too far. But Maya and Oliver knew better. That night, Maya awoke to a familiar sound. The whispers were back, faint but unmistakable, calling her name. She looked at her hand and saw the spiral glowing softly in the dark. She knew she couldn't ignore the call forever. The grove wasn't done with her, it never would be. Story 4: The Hollow Meadow. Chapter 1: The Vanishing Field. The Hollow Meadow had always been a place of beauty and mystery. Wildflowers of every color blanketed the field, and a single towering oak stood at its center. The meadow was enchanting by day, but no one dared to venture there after sunset. Locals whispered of strange disappearances, claiming the meadow swallowed people whole. Emily and her brother, Nate, dismissed the warnings as folklore. The two had come to spend the summer with their grandmother, whose house sat on the edge of the meadow. Don't go wandering in the dark, their grandmother had warned. But one twilight, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily spotted something unusual, a faint light glowing near the oak. Against Nate's protests, she stepped into the field. Chapter 2: The Glow. The closer Emily got to the oak, the stronger the glow became. It shimmered like a will-o'-the-wisp, dancing just out of reach. Nate followed reluctantly, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. "Emily, stop," he hissed. But she didn't listen. The light was hypnotic, pulling her deeper into the meadow. Then, without warning, the glow vanished. Emily blinked, disoriented, as the meadow plunged into silence. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. "Where did it go?" she whispered. Nate tugged her arm. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned to head back, the meadow had changed. The flowers were gone, replaced by jagged thorns, and the path they had come down was no longer there. Chapter 3: The Whispering Shadows. The siblings wandered through the meadow, their unease growing with every step. The air felt thick, and the horizon stretched endlessly, as if the meadow had no boundaries. Then they heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. At first, it sounded like the rustling of leaves, but soon, the whispers grew clearer, forming words. "Turn around. Leave." Emily and Nate spun in circles, trying to locate the source. Shadows began to shift among the thorns, darker than the night itself. One of them moved closer, humanoid in shape but utterly featureless. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Nate nodded, gripping her hand. "We're not alone." Chapter 4: The Oak's Secret. As they pressed on, they found themselves drawn toward the towering oak at the meadow's center. Its massive branches twisted like claws against the night sky, and its bark was etched with strange, looping symbols. Emily ran her fingers over the markings, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "What are you doing?" Nate asked, his voice sharp. Emily didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the symbols, which seemed to pulse faintly under her touch. Suddenly, she gasped and stepped back. "I saw something," she said, her face pale. "A woman, trapped in the tree." Nate stared at her, his stomach churning. "We need to leave." But the whispers grew louder, and the meadow had other plans. Chapter 5: The Shadow Figures. The shadows began to emerge fully from the thorny underbrush, forming shapes that were almost human but grotesquely wrong. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They circled the siblings, their whispers overlapping in a chaotic chorus. Emily clutched Nate's arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're trying to keep us here." One of the figures reached out, its shadowy hand stretching impossibly far. Nate swung his flashlight at it, and the beam cut through the figure like mist. It recoiled but didn't disappear. "Run!" he shouted, pulling Emily away from the oak. Chapter 6: The Fractured Meadow. As they ran, the meadow seemed to shift around them. Paths looped back on themselves, and the oak remained visible no matter how far they went. "It's like we're trapped in a maze," Emily said, her breath ragged. Nate glanced over his shoulder and saw the shadows following, growing closer with every step. Then Emily stopped abruptly, pointing to the ground. A patch of wildflowers had reappeared, but they were wilting before their eyes. "It's a sign," she said. "The meadow is alive, it's changing to keep us here." Nate shook his head, pulling her forward. "We'll figure it out later. We just have to keep moving." Chapter 7: The Woman in the Oak. They found themselves back at the oak once again, no matter how far they ran. Emily knelt at its base, her hand trembling as she touched the bark. This time, her vision was clearer. She saw the woman again, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. The woman mouthed a single word: "Help." "Someone's trapped in the tree," Emily said. Nate stared at her in disbelief. "Are you hearing yourself right now? This isn't real." But Emily was certain. "We have to free her. Maybe that's the only way out." Nate hesitated, but the shadows were closing in. Reluctantly, he helped her dig around the tree's base, their fingers scraping against the hard soil. Chapter 8: The Curse of the Meadow. As they dug, the whispers turned into anguished cries. The ground beneath the oak began to tremble, and a sickly, greenish light seeped from the roots. Emily recoiled as a skeletal hand broke through the soil, clutching at the air. "What did we just do?" Nate asked, his voice shaking. The hand was followed by an arm, then a face, hollow and sunken, its mouth open in a silent scream. "You freed the wrong thing," the whispers hissed. The figure from the tree stood fully formed, its eyes burning with malevolence. Chapter 9: The Price of Freedom. The meadow erupted into chaos as the figure unleashed its fury. The shadows bowed before it, their forms merging into its growing mass. Emily and Nate backed away, but the figure's gaze locked onto them. "You disturbed my prison," it said, its voice a low growl. "And now, you'll take my place." Roots shot from the ground, coiling around their ankles. Emily screamed, clawing at the earth as the roots dragged her toward the oak. Nate grabbed her hand, pulling with all his strength. "I won't let it take you," he shouted. But the figure raised a hand, and Nate was thrown backward by an unseen force. Chapter 10: The Hollow Ones. Just as Emily thought she would be consumed, the meadow fell silent. The roots released her, and the figure stopped its advance. It looked at her, then at the oak, as if weighing a decision. Finally, it spoke, "Leave, and never return. The meadow will take what it's owed, later." Emily scrambled to her feet, helping Nate up. Together, they fled, the path opening up before them like a parting sea. When they finally reached their grandmother's house, they collapsed on the porch, gasping for air. But the meadow wasn't done with them. That night, Emily woke to find her reflection missing from the mirror. Instead, the woman from the oak stared back at her, mouthing a single word, "Soon." Story 5: The Drowned Wood. Chapter 1: The Sinking Forest. Hidden deep in the outskirts of Harrow's Hollow, the Drowned Wood was a place of eerie fascination. Legends told of a forest that had been cursed long ago, sinking into a bottomless bog where the trees now stood half-submerged in dark, brackish water. Locals whispered about strange lights flickering between the trees and voices calling for help. Sam and Leah, amateur paranormal investigators, decided the Drowned Wood would be their next exploration. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and an inflatable raft, they arrived at the edge of the swamp just as dusk began to fall. The air smelled of damp rot, and the water lapped against the twisted roots of the trees. "Creepy, but kind of beautiful," Leah said, snapping a picture. Sam grinned. "Let's see if we can find the ghost stories." Chapter 2: The First Ripples. As the raft glided across the water, the forest seemed to come alive. The wind carried faint whispers, and the surface of the swamp rippled unnaturally, though there was no breeze. Sam dismissed it as fish or turtles, but Leah felt uneasy. "It's too quiet," she murmured. Then, something brushed against the bottom of the raft. Leah froze. "Did you feel that?" Sam leaned over the side, shining his flashlight into the murky water. "Probably just a branch," he said. But Leah wasn't convinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from beneath the surface. Chapter 3: The Glow Beneath. As darkness fell, a pale green light began to glow beneath the water, illuminating the roots of the submerged trees. It was mesmerizing and otherworldly. Sam leaned closer, trying to capture it on camera, but his hand slipped, and the flashlight plunged into the swamp. "Great," he muttered, reaching for a spare. But before he could turn it on, the light under the water began to move. It swirled in slow, deliberate patterns, almost like it was alive. "Leah, look at this," he said. But when he turned, he saw her staring blankly into the water, her eyes wide with fear. "There's something down there," she whispered. Chapter 4: The Drowned Ones. Suddenly, the raft lurched, nearly tipping them into the swamp. Leah screamed as the water churned violently. Then they saw them, figures rising from the depths. Their faces were pale and bloated, their eyes black pits, and their mouths gaped open as if screaming underwater. "Row!" Sam shouted, grabbing the oars. But the figures reached for the raft with elongated, skeletal hands. One of them grabbed Leah's ankle, pulling her toward the edge. She kicked wildly, her foot connecting with something solid. The figure let go, sinking back into the water, but the others closed in. Chapter 5: The Forgotten Chapel. Desperate to escape, Sam and Leah paddled toward a patch of dry land in the distance. As they approached, they saw the remains of an old chapel, its stone walls crumbling and covered in moss. They pulled the raft ashore and ran inside, slamming the wooden door behind them. The chapel was dark, lit only by the faint green glow seeping through the cracks. In the center of the room stood an altar, upon which lay a rusted iron box. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, and Leah felt a chill as she ran her fingers over them. "This place is ancient," she said. "And it's not abandoned." Chapter 6: The Keeper of the Swamp. A low, guttural growl echoed through the chapel, and they spun around to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was humanoid but grotesquely deformed, with skin that looked like bark and moss growing from its shoulders. Its eyes glowed the same eerie green as the swamp. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice deep and rasping. Leah clutched Sam's arm. "We're just exploring," she stammered. The creature tilted its head, studying them. "The swamp does not forgive trespasses. You've disturbed the drowned ones." It stepped closer, its massive hand pointing to the altar. "The box must remain closed. Leave now, or join them." Chapter 7: The Temptation. Despite the creature's warning, Sam couldn't resist the pull of the rusted box. "What's inside?" he asked, his curiosity overtaking his fear. The creature's eyes narrowed. "Death," it said, "and a curse that binds this swamp." But Sam had already made up his mind. Ignoring Leah's protests, he approached the altar and touched the box. The moment he did, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic. The air grew colder, and the green light in the chapel flared brightly. "Sam, don't!" Leah screamed, but it was too late. He opened the box. Chapter 8: The Curse Unleashed. A bone-chilling scream erupted from the box, and a dark, shadowy mist poured out, filling the chapel. The creature roared in fury, its bark-like skin cracking as it tried to contain the mist. "You've doomed us all," it bellowed, lunging at Sam. The shadows coalesced into a monstrous figure, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It turned toward Sam and Leah, its hollow eyes glowing with malice. "You freed me," it said, its voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. "Now, you will pay the price." Chapter 9: The Bargain. The creature fought to contain the shadowy figure, but it was clear it was losing. "There's a way to stop this," it growled, looking at Leah. "But it requires a sacrifice." Leah's heart pounded. "What kind of sacrifice?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "One of you must stay. The swamp demands balance." Leah turned to Sam, who looked at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Leah, we can't," he started, but the shadow was closing in. The creature extended its hand. "Choose. Or the swamp will choose for you." Chapter 10: The Swamp's New Guardian. Tears streaming down her face, Leah stepped forward. "I'll stay," she said. The creature nodded solemnly and placed its hand on her shoulder. The shadows halted, retreating into the box, which slammed shut. The creature turned to Sam. "Go. And never return." Sam tried to protest, but the swamp began to shift, pulling him back toward the raft. "Leah," he shouted, but she was already fading into the green glow, her form merging with the swamp. The last thing he saw was her face, serene but sorrowful, as she became one with the drowned wood. Sam escaped the swamp, but he would never forget Leah's sacrifice. And on quiet nights, he swore he could hear her voice in the wind, calling him back to the place he vowed never to return.